Hello and welcome back. Today we are doing something a little bit different, taking a slight break from building a Slack clone to work on the Treblle Runtime package. So previously, Treblle did something a little bit different. So come to our docs and come down to our PHP package, and let's just look at the node framework because that's where I'm starting. So previously, it relied on Guzzle to send any HTTP requests. And what you do is you bootstrap everything up, do the error reporting, object start, all that kind of usual stuff. Then create a factory, mask your sensitive information, and then it would kind of just send the data in the background. And it was kind of cool. But we've got different packages for Symfony, for anything outside of Laravel and Symfony, and then there's Laravel itself. So while it was good, it was also a bit of a pain, especially from a kind of maintenance perspective. And with the changes in how the frameworks are moving forward and the language is moving, we're looking at centralizing how that might work. So I have started work on a new package called the Runtime PHP. So this is the Treblle Runtime package. And the idea of it is that it will just be very flexible. So I've started a little test file here. And the idea is that instead of using an array for configuration, let's be a little bit stricter. Let's have an actual object. Let's enforce specific standards along the way. And our old field masking, what it did was it would take the value here and it will just take the exact same length and replace it with the same length as stars. But what we're doing in the new version is giving it a bit more of a superpower. So for example, we've got a string matcher, which is our kind of current behavior. Then we've got an email matcher. And what that will do is it will take the email address and it will star out the user aspect of the email, but keep the @domain. Because what we were finding is when this data was being passed up to Treblle to be ingressed and then came through to the dashboard, people were going through the requests, looking at the payloads, and there was no kind of context. They wanted to see a little bit more, perhaps. Maybe they wanted a specific key, but they didn't want to send the whole data. So I've built this new masking engine, and we're going to walk through that as well. And then we've got our runtime package over here, which accepts the config, transport that we're going to send, and then the masking engine passing through the config to there. Finally, the runtime will just process a lot of data. So it will take all the server information that's needed, anything to do with the language that's needed, the request information, the response information, and any errors that might have occurred. So what I want to do here is walk through the package, how it works, how I want it to work, and carry on building it, because you don't get to see this sort of package build very often, so I thought it would be very useful to share. Where am I currently? Well, currently, I left it in a broken state. So I'm looking at a way to build up the payload in my runtime. It's down here. So if I just come here and dump on the data itself, you'll see that I'm actually getting that data through in the format that I would expect it. But what we want to do is we actually want to build this up in a very specific way. We want to build up a payload. And the payload is this little object here that takes the API key, project ID, what version we're on, the SDK information, and the data itself. And the data is the server, language, response, and request, and then any possible errors. So what we're going to do, we're going to walk through how we might build this. And this payload object is really good, but it's not quite how I want it to work. I want it to be a little bit nicer in terms of use case. So I'm going to get this face off the screen and we're going to focus in on the code like I like to, because the code's why we're here, right? So let's just zoom in a little bit. And what we're going to do, we're going to have a look at what we are able to do here. So transport payloads. So we got our payload. What I'm thinking here is it might be nice to have a pending payload. So the idea of this is that it's a flexible, buildable way to build the payload. So that if we ever extend it, we only extend it in one place and it's all good. So a pending payload, this will obviously need a constructor. And the two things that it's going to require is, let's have a read-only string for the API. I think it's API ID or app ID. Let's go back and check. API key and project ID. So we're going to kind of take those to here, and then we're going to have a read-only string for that project ID. So at this point, we're going to want to have, we've got this pending payload, this initial state. And then what we're also going to want is this version SDK and data. This is all stuff that we're going to add more after the fact. So if I pop that in there, what I'm going to do is, if I make this nullable to start with, then what we want to do is make sure that we build this up. So let's just clean that. So we'll have a pending payload, which will then allow us to say public function version, which will accept a string as a version and return a pending payload. This will then set the version and return itself. So as you can see, it's very chainable, much like what you might see in the Laravel framework itself. It's one of the really good patterns that I find works nicely. So then we're going to set the SDK. And then finally, we're going to set the data as well. And yes, I am losing my voice again. And finally, we're just going to have one final method, build, which is going to return a payload. Return new payload. This payload going to have the API key, has this API key, project ID, version, SDK, and data. So this is its final form. So what we want to do here is this Treblle class here. We're going to add maybe the runtime might be a good place to put it. Let's put it up here. So we're going to have a public static function payload. So what we need to pass into that is nothing, but this will return a pending payload. So we can then say return new pending payload, where the API key is this config API key. Project ID is this config project ID. And that's all we need. Oh, no, it's not going to allow me, is it? Okay, just passing the config for now. We'll play around with it. So swap out this part. and that'll do its job. So over in my test file over here, what I'm going to do after config, let's just ignore all of this below here, and we're going to work our way up to it. So we don't want to create the runtime yet. We're going to create the payload first. So we're going to have a runtime payload config. Now, if we dump on this payload, I'm going to open up Warp to make it a little bit easier to, no, not Wallet and Apple Pay, because I don't really use you. Warp, there we go. And runtime test. So we're getting a failure because of how I've set up Composer. So now we've got our pending payload. And what we want to be able to do with that is once we've got the payload, we then want to add additional information to it. So we're going to say that the version is going to be runtime version. The SDK is going to be PHP in this case. Let me just drop all this down a few lines. So we're building it out. We want to set the version. We want to set the SDK to be PHP. Then we're going to want to set the data to be data make. Well, hey, monkey. Again. And finally, we will build. And then finally, it will build. And that will give us a different object. Now, this data make, it accepts server language request, response, and errors. So we want to build up to that. And hello, everyone in the chat. Thank you for joining me. Not as fun as a Slack clone, but it's an interesting insight. So for now, what I'm going to do is if we just comment that part out, let's come back to Warp. And this is like that. So we're getting there. We're building this pending payload. And then this data here, we want to kind of have this data builder because each one's going to be built up at a different point. We might be able to build a lot of it up straight away and then pass information into it. So down here, we've got data, got the pending payload, and we're going to have a data builder. It's kind of like a pending data, but I don't know if that makes sense from a naming perspective. So let's just have that constructor there. Let's just compare it to what we need on the data itself. So server, language, request, response, and errors. Put that to one side and have the pending data on this side. So we don't actually need anything to start this data. But we know we are going to need a public. We know we're going to need that server. We're going to need a language. We're going to want that request. So we're going to get that transport request as a request, get the response, and then public null array for errors. And we're just going to set that to null as well. So we've got this concept of we are almost there. So again, we're going to want to have eventually this public function build method, and I'm probably going to create an interface for this, and then this will return data, and we'll return that new data based on the server, the language, request, response, and errors. So we're going to eventually build this up. It is going to complain that server null is being given, but we will get to that part. So again, public function server, and accept a server, pending data, and then language. This PHP Storm AI stuff is actually pretty good. Not server request interface, don't be silly. Public function request, pending data, response, and then finally errors. Finally, it gets built. So down in this pending payload, the data is actually going to be a pending data, I think would be the best case here. So then down here, pending data, this data, and down here we can say this data build, like that. So then over on our test, yes, the Slack project is getting there. I think I'm almost there with the webhooks. But speaking to a few people, there's someone who's working on some really, really good webhook content at the minute, and I don't want to steal their thunder, so I'm not going to dive too deep into it. Okay, so next up, we're going to come to here. And what we want this to be, this data part here, is the data is going to be a new pending data where we will then set the server to be a server, the language will be a language, the request, the response, the errors, and that's all we want that to be. So we're going to build that up. Tell you what I'll do, I will just get that out of that to get rid of some red squiggles. And we will drop this back a level for now. And this will be, we'll override the payload and just dump it down here. So currently, this isn't going to work. Let's just dump that. So too few arguments count sent through. So there's a couple of things that we know are going to be done. So on the server, we know we're going to need a new server. So we can do something like server make. That'll accept an array. Language will be wow. I keep hitting the wrong key on my keyboard. So language make, and then this will be request make. That's anything about data, and a lot of this I want it to be hidden so that it's easy. All that be kind of all you need to do from a integration perspective is just pass it through. I just want it to be that simple. Now this pending data, so we come up here, runtime payload and runtime data. So public static function data pending data return new pending data. That's all I want there. So then up down on this test, this can then be runtime data. Then we attach the server. Let's just neaten this up. So then we've got a server here. Simplify that one. Simplify that. We're just going to simplify all of them to make it look a little bit nicer while we're working with it. So server make. Then we get our language. Then we get our request, response, and errors. So down here, errors is an empty array for now. And that's built, and we are good. So the language, what does the language take? Name, version, whether we're exposing PHP, and whether we want to display errors. Now, a lot of this is something that we can easily do. So let's pop that over there. So the name, we can pass that in quite easily. I believe we should just be able to say PHP here. And then we want to grab the version. And what we actually want for this is this constant PHP version. Next, expose PHP. We want to do an ini check. So if I come over to Arc, there is, if I come to this here, we're going to go look at the repo. So what he's got at the minute, I believe, is a PHP helper. And what it does is it gets an ini value. And that uses the safe package right now. And what we want to do is basically have a way to get this information. So over in PHP Storm, what we can have is a new directory for support. And for this, I'm going to just create a PHP class. And we'll have a public static function name, which is going to return a string. For now, it's just going to return PHP. Public static function version. We're going to return PHP version. Sorry, let's make sure you can see all of this. Do we expose PHP? Public static version expose PHP. That wants to return a string, and we'll do that in a second. And public static function display errors. Again, that'll be a string. So we're going to have a public static function ini string argument, and that's going to return a string. Not init, ini. So what we want to do is use this safe library here because it's going to be the most helpful. So the coding machine safe is the package in question. Come over to here, and what we'll do is composer require coding machine safe. So we want to install that. And then what we can do is we can say value is equal to ini ini get, I believe, safe ini get. The option we want to get is the argument that we passed in. And then if we come back to arc, what we want to do is we want to make sure it's a Boolean. Let me just close that off a second. Value, filter var. So filter var, what that accepts is value and filter options. So value is value. Filter options. So we're doing an ini get. Safe info exception, not a big deal. I can work with that. So then what we've got is we want to, if it's a bool, we want to just return on or off, basically. Or do that. And we want to catch that exception and return unknown. So this is what we're aiming for. So we're going to grab that and we're just going to rewrite it to be a little bit more modern. So this is arg ini get needs an option. Then we've got a value filter options. Then what we're going to do here is we're actually just going to catch a throwable and ignore it. Then down here, let's just fix that whole file a second. So at the minute, what we're doing is if it's a Boolean, then we want to run a check and say if the variable value is an empty string and the variable value does not equal 0, then return it is on. Otherwise, it is off. Otherwise, just cast that ini get to a string, which it should already be at this point. Then we're going to catch a throwable, ignore it, and if we can't find that value, we're just going to return unknown. So expose PHP. On the language helper, we're doing an ini get for expose PHP and display errors. So we can return static ini, and the arg is expose PHP. Then we can do the exact same thing down here with display errors. Now this is going to be that, that's that, although we want to configure it to be self. There we go. That's a lot nicer. So we've got a nice easy way to do it in one place. Yes, it's static calls, but they work. So down here on our PHP is we are also going to want to, this helper is also going to help us make the language. Return new language where the name is self name, version is self version, the expose PHP is self expose PHP, and the display errors is that. So we've built up our language. So over on this part, what we can actually do here is remove that and say that our language is PHP language. Simplify, and that is a lot cleaner and nicer to work with. I don't know if it's a flu, but all I know is that I'm losing my voice. I feel absolutely fine and healthy, but apparently that may not be the case. Right, so server. What do we need in server? We need all of this stuff. Let's come back to Arc and let's have a look at how this works for the server by default. So we're using some default variables here. So what we want to do is have a nice way to work with this. So we've got support there, PHP. So we're going to have an additional one, and we're going to call it system. So what the server needs is the IP, time zone, and stuff like that. So we can say public static function IP is going to return a string. We'll get to that in a minute. Public static function time zone string. Then we're going to want an OS. So public static function OS. We'll come back to OS actually. So rent software public static function signature. Again, also return a string. We have a static function for the protocol, and then the encoding. Static function encoding. Now, over on this OS, we're going to have the OS name, release, and architecture. And we haven't got any of those yet, so we can simply put public static function name, public static function release, again a string, public static function architecture. Then at the very end, we're going to have public static server, static function server, which is going to return a server. So we will return a new server. And that first argument is the IP. So we can say IP is going to be self IP. Time zone is self time zone. OS is going to be a new OS. We'll come back to that. Software, self software, signature, protocol, and encoding. Now this OS is going to have a name, self name, release, and architecture. So we've got a nice way to build it all up. So over here, this server is going to be system server. And the reason they're being split out into these classes like this is because eventually these could grow, they could do other things, and we could get additional information. So let's go fill out this part here. So the IP address. We know we can get the IP address by getting server variable. And what we're going to want to do is something like this. We're going to have a public static function from global, and we're going to pass through that global, and that's going to return a string. So what we're going to want to do is that eventually is So we've got the global and the arg. So we want to say global arg and again unknown. So that'll do that. So this, in theory, should always be an array. If we come up to IP, we want to return self from global. Now, the global that we care about here, not glob, the global is underscore server, and the argument is server address. Now, time zone. That is going to be default time zone get. Default time zone get, that always returns a string. Awesome. Now, software comes from the server. So we can say return self from global, and the global is server, and the arg is server software. And all of this is something that we can very easily unit test as well. So then we come down to the server signature. Now these can be null. That is the biggest problem with doing some of these. But these are mainly kind of meta bits that are partially useful when you're working within Treblle. They're not as useful as other areas that we're going to be collecting. So there's a protocol. Encoding going to be that. So if we return that, we want to return HTTP accept encoding. So there's that. There we go. Then these parts, the name, release, and architecture, these are all kind of uname things and PHPOS, and there's lots of things that are different here. So the name, OS, uname R, I believe that should be A. Let's check that actually. So A default contains everything, release, operating system, version, machine type. So I believe we should be returning M there. Is that what we did last time? Yes, it was. So one thing to bear in mind is that this PHP uname there, let's simplify that. This here, go away, you error, is that actually gives us a lot more information. So we've got all different modes available. SN, R, V, and M. So we could actually extend what we're currently capturing on the OS side by adding these additional parts. So what we will do is we'll hover over that. And we're just going to open this. So we got the OS name. we're getting that from elsewhere already. Host name. We could always add the host name. So let's add that. Public static function host. We can return PHP uname host name. And then this can also accept public string host. And add a param of string and host. Down here, we're going to have host of the string, host, data host, and then down here, we're going to have host of the string if it's returned to an array. So down here, we can now add this, self-host, fantastic. Release, I believe we're doing release already. Yep. Version information and machine type. So name, host, release, architecture, and public static function version. Return PHP uname the version information. There we go. And what we want to do is version string, public string version, param string version. That's all got that in. That's all got that in. And we just want to make sure we add it in to array. Host version sorted. So now version new OS is all done. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We are doing some fun stuff with this. So that's getting all of the information that we're going to want to get about the server. So that in our test over here, system, server, it just gets what we need. Hidden out the way, nice and easy, it's built for us. Language is done. Now the request, response and errors, they are all handled slightly differently. So let's just come up to there like that. And what we're going to want to do is say the request, response, errors. They're all going to be built differently. So a lot of this stuff can be done really early on. So what we realistically want to do is this pending part needs to be elsewhere. We aren't going to pass that in. So this payload here, this pending data, on this part, we can actually say server is system server, and the language is PHP language. Now, also on this pending payload, we can get the version and the SDK already. So we can say the version is self version, and the SDK is the PHP SDK. So that's built, that's built. So over on our test over here, we actually don't need any of that. The data, we just want to do runtime data and then pass that on. This is getting easier and easier because the system is able to tell us a lot of stuff anyway. So let's just do that and just drop this down a level. Now, if I come over to warp, do a quick composer dump again. And that, so now we aren't able to build the request. So this is the part that needs to be built and passed in from the middleware. So the way that our current packages work is that the middleware is actually passed in, or sorry, the data is passed in through middleware. So if we go have a look at an implementation, for example, like Treblle Laravel, what happens is we have some middleware, and down here we build up the data and pass through the load time, and it's all built and done for us. Ooh, if possible, because the next video will be about Laravel and RabbitMQ or Kafka with CRUD. Maybe. We shall see on that one. Right, before I lose my voice anymore, I'm just going to have a quick drink while people catch up and see what we are doing. So, at this point, this payload wants to be partially built by the time it comes to try and send it all the way down here. So that payload process, so this runtime process, we've already got config there, payload data, build up that add the masking engine. So this bit is something that we definitely want now because we got all of that. So if we grab that and have that there, at this point, the runtime will also add the payload. So private payload. We want to pass that in. Payload, this is a pending data. So what we can do down here is data is itself data. Although in reality, I could just grab that instead. Put it in there. We no longer need that call. We've got one call to default all of that. So that's only ever written, not read. So over in test down here, our payload can also be runtime payload. And we don't actually need to pass in that config anymore. Or do we? Maybe we do. So the config is this config, or just config. That should be it there. That's further down than it needs to be. So let's just sort those arguments. Runtime payload. So over on our runtime, this is actually going to be a pending payload. That's all good. So by the time we've got a runtime, what we want to do is we want to add a request, add a response, and add any errors. So if we just close a lot of this down, like that. So this bit can go. And we will just die and dump on the runtime. So we got this part up to date. So we've got all of this information, name, host, version, release architecture, software signature and protocol. That's not picking it up because it wasn't a HTTP request, which I guess is to be expected. We got all of that information, request, response, and errors. So now, when we process, what we want to do is something slightly different. So there's a payload there. Process is going to do something slightly different. So for now, we're just going to forget about that method. And that is just talking to the ingress. And we're going to worry about creating payload a little bit later. So let's just ignore all of that. So we're going to have the runtime injected into our middleware. Then what we will have, public function request, we're going to get some form of data coming in, and we are going to return the runtime. So down here, what we can do is say this payload data request I believe this should do it. Maybe. Can it? Maybe, yeah. So request will return pending data. So this payload data is that return this. So this request there is going to take in a request. So we want to do a request make on the data. The request there, data is there, data, and that should work. Cannot call method request on that. Because it is, let's get a pending payload. That should be fine. None of those are read-only. They're all public. Why can it not call it? Oh, could potentially be null. Guess that's it. Was it that? One of those. Okay, so if this payload data does not equal null, then we want to set it, basically. Do a couple of checks. Use payload request. Okay, so now that is going to want to fix that. Okay, we're going to get back to that bit. And then this part here, this accepts all of this. And what we want to do is we want to mask this data itself. So we're going to, maybe we'll build up to this bit. So let's say like runtime request, data for the request is an array. And what this needs is basically that. So let's come up here and let's just drop that in, uncomment that. Timestamp URL, all that good stuff. Headers. body for the user. And then we've got payments. So we're passing that through now. And let's just do another die and dump down here on the runtime. So at this point, we've got our data, we've got the language, and the request is now in there, but the request body is still the raw body that we don't actually want. So data has a request method. Let me double check. It probably does. No, it doesn't. Yeah, I'm going to ignore that for now. This should return error. Right, so we'll ignore that for now. So we got this part, and then on the runtime over here, we've got this data bit here. Now, what this data actually gets for that request is timestamp, IP, the URL, user agent, method, bunch of headers, and the body. So what I want to do is look at an array merge of data and the body being this masking engine mask data body. I want to mask the data by default. So now again, if we come to warp, and it again, what we should have now is the body is now masked. So anything that's been configured to be masked is masked. Nice and clean. You mean payload? Let me have a payload. Oh, you mean the pending payload? Version SDK data. No. Let me just go back through this a second. So that's returning a pending payload, and we're passing version and SDK and data in by default. So don't want that to be null. Which should resolve issues down here. But we're not actually calling build yet, so that's fine. We will come back to actually building. Payload language, payload pending data. Awesome. So down here, we've passed in the request, and this happens in the middleware. Then we also want to, in the middleware, let's say runtime response, and pass in some more data there. So we've done the request. Public function response. I'm going to have an array of data and return runtime. So if that's not null, this payload data is this payload data response. Return this. Now down here, the response needs to be response make data. Again, is an array merge because we want to make sure we're masking data. Bring the data. And then the body is this masking engine mask. and the payload we want to mask is data body again. So it's very much the same thing. I'm going to ignore that, but we can fix that issue through typecasting stuff. So then the response is all the way down here. And this is what we want to grab. So this response then gets passed data, which is that. Let's just fix that up. And there we go. So our request does that, our response passes that, and then we get the runtime. Come back to warp, clear it out, and there we go. The response password is hashed as it's been configured to do. But if we come up to here and we just comment that out, come to warp and resend it, it's not hashed. So it makes this super easy and we can build our own matches where we need them. Date of birth is matched. So we know that's been matched. So date of birth will mask the year, not the day and month. Password will mask the entire thing. Email will mask the user portion. Social Security will mask everything but the final four, and so will the payments for credit cards. So all of those are masking as I would expect them to. User agents being passed in okay. Headers, now we're going to do some header masking by default in a little while, because there's going to be an array of headers that we want to also mask. So now we've got the config. This will be built by the implementation. So in Laravel, we will load that from config, and we'll say like config Treblle, like that, and we'll just say, I don't know, config equals config make, like that. And that'll make the config when we're building it in our container definition. Then we'll be masking. Runtime will do all of its business. This, again, will be another container definition. Then in our middleware, we do this and that. And then at the end of the middleware, we will just run. We want to get the runtime payload data build. That will give us, we want to set that then. So on the process, we don't want to send data across. That can be ignored for now. That is all going to be ignored as well. So this process, now what we want to do, instead of creating the payload, is just build that payload. So up here, what we will do is this payload data equals this payload data build. And then, why is it complaining? So come to the payload, pending payload. So that could be pending data or data. So that over on runtime down here, it is allowed to set it. Called it undefined method. I can live with that. So then we're going to get that, and we're going to say the payload is this payload. And then send it. We can What did I delete? I deleted something. Didn't want to delete something. There we go, up here. So this payload data is going to be this payload data build, send it. Then we want to send this payload. That gets payload and sends it. Although this could quite easily just say this payload, which means we don't have to pass that. And we can just say this send. Like that. And then we start putting our fiber. So, does it work? Nope. Data construct argument 5 must be of type array. Errors. So we haven't done errors. Okay, so pending data. What we would do is let's go to default to an array anyway. So ingress argument 1 payload must be of type payload. Pending payload given. So we also need to build a payload. Okay, so we are getting there. This is a pending payload, but it could also be a payload. No, we'll just do it down here. This payload build. And the build method down there, that automatically builds the data. So this can then be skipped. So the process is just responsible for doing that. Right. And we're good. So that has been sent to here, and we got it. As you can see, we've got some masked data already in there. Everything is sent in the way that I expected it to. We are good. Our runtime is working, and all that our implementation actually needs to do is not much. Property can be read-only. Can it? Let's just have a pint and see what's left. Config is only written but never read. Okay, so that apparently doesn't need config being passed in, but the payload does. Got to be a nice way to handle that. Drop that. That'll do. Time. Doesn't actually need config there. Missing parameter config. Trebllle calling runtime constructor. No, it doesn't. Okay, so that's all good. We got the runtime. We can set the request. That's implementation detail, and then we process the request. So we don't actually need any output there, so we can just drop that, and all of this big nasty code there can just be removed because we have built up to that in a bit more of a usable way. Send it. Perfect. Now we need to also send over a load time. So the payload is going to be all that for now. We're going to add one additional thing on here, and we're going to have a public int float for load time, but we're going to default that to 0. Param int float load time. No. Static make, we're going to add it in, but it's not going to be a required thing. So load time null int or float. And down here, load time. If we don't pass it in, wonky. We're just going to set that to 0 there. And then we cast it to an array. This load time is load time. Load time is int float there. So this pending payload was complaining about. There we go, fixing up some of this. Data's still being complained about, but that's not a big deal. Pending payload. Build int float load time. Load time is load time. So that final step is going to kind of get the timing and pass it all together. So the runtime, when we send it all the way down here, build needs to get a load time. For now, I'm just going to add 0. The constructor is going to have a private int float start as 0, which means that kind of needs to be at the end. And it can also be read only. So all the way up here, what we also want to do is add in that if it's going to be 0, we can say start is macro time there. And when we process, what we're going to get down here is macro time minus this start. Time difference between when we started and when we sent the request. Now, that's not the perfect way to do it, but I'm looking for a better way. I'll have another drink and hope my throat returns. So now when we send the request, the arc and come over to here. I hate that it's encoded. It's really, really, really annoying. Body response, errors, nothing in there. Data schema, data server. Don't know if it's actually including all of that. Let's just clear it out and come back to PHP Storm. So the payload is a pending payload. This pending payload will return a payload, and then that payload after data will have a load time. This load time. So it is all there. I'm just not seeing it. Let's just do a quick composer dump autoloader. Send that, come back to Arc, and do we have it? Errors is let's just copy that as a PHP array for now. We're just going to create a new Scratch file. And we want this to be a PHP Scratch file. Okay, so arc, we're not seeing it. Maybe, request body. Oh, we don't know. There we go, load time. That is our current load time, running in a PHP fiber. Now, what happens, let me just remove that Scratch. What happens if we don't run that in a fiber? And instead of that, we just say this send. Is there much difference? I'm not 100% sure if there will be. 0.003, 0.002. There is a minute difference. So from a performance perspective, it's not really much. But it's something. Now, the next step is let's map out what happens. So we've got our DI container, right? This is our DI container. It's fantastic. And what happens is we boot our application. And part of that will be loading our packages. Now, when we load packages, that will inject things into our container, which is absolutely wonderful. But once our application boots, it will receive a request. And once that request has been received, it will return a response. Very standard stuff, right? So we boot the application, receives a request, and returns a response. Now, what happens over here is it goes through the middleware pipeline. So that goes there. That goes there. Let's just do that. And this is, let's make sure that sends backwards. And then we're going to do another circle, slightly smaller, like this. Actually, that's not a good way to explain it, maybe. Maybe we'll do boxes. Boxes work, right? We got this before middleware over here. And what I'm going to do is copy that to up there. And this is after middleware. So what actually happens is, if I just grab all of this like that, and we're just going to move all of that up there. And this actually comes to there. This sends it through after the before middleware. It will send the request, return the response, hit that after middleware. Then over here, this is the user. What they do is they will send that request to the application and they will get a response back over here. But once all of that is done, what also happens is we have this terminate middleware in some frameworks, and then that is what is then called there. Now, what is going to be the easiest way for this to work? So our user will make the request. It'll load the packages into our DI container, and then perform middleware, receive request, return the response, get the after middleware, and terminate the middleware. And what happens over here is that all of this kind of lives on this server. So this is our server software. And what happens is this server software will send a trigger all the way up to there. Can we Command and J to bring forward? Perfect. No, that wasn't working. Okay, so we'll just do it this way. Bring forward, or can we just select that and send it to the back? No, apparently not. So we're just going to move this slightly out of the way over here, so it's a little bit nicer to read. Return the response, after middleware, and then that one can actually be deleted. We'll just move this all the way down here instead. There we go. So what I'm going to do is just do that, make it a little bit nicer to read. So if I zoom out slightly, the request will come in to the server, which will boot the application, load all the packages into the DI container and into the application. All good. We'll then send a request through the perform middleware to the controller, which will return a response through the after middleware back to the user. Then once that has happened, that will signal the end of the process, which will tell the server to then run any terminating middleware right at the end. However, that isn't needed when you're using PHP fibers. Because what a PHP fiber will do is it will just asynchronously call it and just return. It will just, okay, here's my fiber. I'm going to start and carry on. It's not going to block that process. So, start. Start the execution of the fiber, returns when the fiber suspends or terminates. That's really. Let's float through. Yeah, cool. So that is actually working. Now, just clean some of this up. It just does. Okay, so I think we are onto a winner there. That is working. Our implementation, yeah, if we hide all of that and all of that, that is config. That is DI container. All we have to do is pass it a request and pass it the response. Now we can actually do this, slightly differently if we want to. We can maybe pass that response object. So let's just refactor to that because that might be a little bit nicer, I think. No, that's a read only. Okay, no, we want to keep it as an array for now. Perfect. Okay, blah, 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 lots of stuff. So what does the request need? Let's do that. And let's just resolve some of these issues. So this request, put it over here. It's going to need a timestamp, which it wants as a string. And I want the IP address of the request as a string, the URL it's going to as a string, the user agent string, the method as a string, headers as a header, and then it's going to want the body as an array. And this, well, array object for this array will be a string next for now. So that's all that. This is complaining about pending data request. So pending data. Where do we build that? Down here, payload build. So what we want to do is amend this to have pending data. That's complaining there. So as long as we build it correctly, it shouldn't be a problem. So then the response, let's open up this response and make sure we got the array shape correct there as well. So headers is going to be an array. The code needs to be an integer. The size needs to be an int or string. Load time is actually passed through in there, so I can remove it from other places. Memory usage is null, int or float, and the body is a string or an array or an object or null. Yep, it's that bad. Okay, so we've got that part done. We're sending. We want to try to send the fiber. Copy that. We want to try to send the fiber. Catch. Anything's purple. And for now, we're just going to ignore it because we want it to fail quietly. There we go. That does that bit. Ingress, unhandled exception. So could say that, or that. So what we're going to do is just throws a throwable. Process returns void. And the purpose of this is to process the payload and send through the transport. Send the ingress payload through to the transport once built. Then this one is add the request data to the payload data response. Well, I can copy that. And up here, we can add that. Create a new pending payload. Then the constructor and all of that good stuff. The HTTP transport that is being used. The pending payload for ingress. The configured masking engine. When did this request start? So if I remove that as read only, and I think that should be public. Hey, that's not public. That's public. So what I'm imagining here is if you're using something like Octane, depending when the container boots, this start time could be incorrect. So we want to be able to add that at a specific point. So memory limit, memory usage, get memory, get peak usage. There we go. We come back to here and let's send it again. Now let's double check it. We've got that usage, memory usage down here. Apparently we used that many bytes. The response is all there, and the load time is 1 second. Macro time, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we are good. I think that just about covers it. Next is testing, because testing is important. So we've got the masking engine test. I believe I added this. There we go. So we've got tests in here already. A lot of this testing could probably be ignored. Or some of it could be at least. There we go. We've got the engine on the top. Get the engine. That returns an engine. So that's all the masking. That's good. Support. We want to get some information. So let's add a new package there. And we'll say support. And we're just going to create a support test. This is going to extend the package test case. And I'm using PHP unit for this because it made sense at the time. So we're going to have a public function. It can get the version. So this assert equals expected is going to be PHP version. The actual is going to be PHP version. Then we are going to say that that's a test. Now come back to warp. Compose a test. I'm going to come over to the composer file a second. All the way down here. I'm going to add test docs onto it. There we go. It can get the version. Plan to stick. So what we want to do is close all the other tabs and start testing. We want to make sure that these are all doing what we want to do. So public function, it can get the name of the language, which is a bit of a pointless test, if I'm honest. Can we have to do that? And we'll swap that for PHP and add test. So version expose PHP. Public function, it can get the expose PHP ini value. Ini set. And what we want to set, the option is expose PHP, and the value is 0. False. That expects a string. So we can ini set, then assert expose is false. Ooh, failed to get the name of a language. Come back to warp. There we go. So you can get the name of a language. Now let's test that. So why are we failing? An error occurred. There's got to be a way I can set these things on the fly. Let's ignore that. Let's just run it. So on. And in our CI test, we just need to make sure that we have that configured. Public function, it can get the expose PHP init value. There we go. Display errors. Ini. Why do I keep typing in it? Why are you bringing a cat to my office?
Live stream.
Nope, we got a kitty cat on the live. I've not even got my camera on.
Oh, you could show everyone.
My wife wants to show everyone the kitty cat.
Look where it jumps off his desk.
If that laptop was working, let's just come over here to do it. So,
That is glitchy.
hello, kitty cat cat. Come and say hello. Hello, kitty cat. My laptop's frozen.
That's weird.
Um,
You're very quiet. I didn't actually realise.
So, yes. Do a program live for the company where I work? I do. That is part of my job. And this is obviously the package that we are building, what I am building for us. And it's, yeah. It is the future of our kind of packages for languages. So the idea is that it's super fine-tuned so that our documentation can be updated to be a lot simpler, is the idea. And also the maintenance is a lot easier in the long run. So what we also want to do is public. Why do I keep writing that? So public function, it can get the language object. Now, I think this is maybe a bit of a useless test. So we're going to assert equals, no. Expected is going to be new language. The name is PHP. The version is, well, I'm not really sure what my version is. I don't have a Tinker file. About Tinkerwell though. Tinkerwell solves all. Oh, I think I missed. Oops. Oopsies. PP version. Run that. So that is what I'm expecting currently. Suppose PHP to be on. Annoy me. There we go. And then display errors to be on. Then the actual is going to be PHP language. That's it. So warp. Run the test. And I didn't have to ping again. There we go. We can give a language object. So that has been sorted. We can then move on to the system. And we will end up doing the exact same thing. Now, that's going to be really boring for you to watch, so I'm not going to do it on stream. I won't put you through that. Instead, I will say, that's it, I think. Going to do another stream soon. Maybe tomorrow, check my calendar. If not, it'll be Friday. I've already done 3 this week, which is what I wanted to do. Maybe you can help me build another SDK, the Golang one or TypeScript or Rust or, something that you're going to watch me sweat on. So for now, thank you very much. As usual, stay awesome. Like, subscribe. Don't forget to go subscribe to the Treblle channel because I'm eventually going to be streaming and doing stuff a lot more on there once the subscriber account gets up. So go subscribe over there. Give me an excuse to stream over there instead. Thank you. Stay awesome. Have a good day. And I'm going to go have coffee. Goodbye.